Most cartels deal in white powder, using tunnels, submarines, and hitmen to protect their territory. But if you want to see the ultimate version of a cartel, one that doesn't just bypass the law, but owns it, you have to look at a Brazilian construction company. A company that secretly paid over $800 million in bribes, reaching at least a dozen presidents across an entire continent. With consequences so devastating, it even drove a former president to take his own life. In 2016, the world discovered a secret hidden inside one of the largest engineering firms on the planet. There was a hidden room protected by a double encrypted communication system called Drousys. Inside this room, there were no architects or engineers. There were only bribery experts. This is the story of Odebrecht, a company that built the infrastructure of modern South America, while running one of the most sophisticated criminal network in history. This is why every cartel should aim to be a construction giant instead of a street gang. Odebrecht's story starts in 1944 in Brazil, when Norberto Odebrecht, the grandson of a German engineer and cartographer who emigrated to Brazil in 1856, founded a small construction company. That firm would later grow into a giant responsible for one of the biggest corruption cases in human history. Norberto Odebrecht understood a fundamental rule of dark finance. In developing nations, the government is the biggest client, and the government is made of people, and every person has a price if you know how to pay it. By the 1980s, Odebrecht wasn't just a company. It was a shadow state with its own foreign policy. They built the Miami International Airport, massive highways in Angola, hydroelectric dams in the Peruvian jungle, and a lot of major infrastructure across the Americas. They had a philosophy called survival through service. But the real service was ensuring they always won the contract. They created an internal culture so loyal it felt like a cult, where employees were trained to be soldiers of the empire. This loyalty allowed them to keep secrets that would eventually topple entire national governments. But to understand the scale, you have to understand the mind of the man who took it to the next level. Under the leadership of the grandson, Marcelo Odebrecht, known as the Prince, the company reached its final, most lethal form. Marcelo wasn't just an engineer, he was a master of systemic corruption who believed that bribes were a necessary tax for progress. He created something unprecedented in corporate history: the division of structured operations. Think about this. In a normal company, you have accounting, HR, and marketing departments. At Odebrecht, they had a professional, fully funded department of bribery that operated like a Swiss bank. This wasn't amateur hour. They used a secret software called MyWebDay to track every illegal dollar across the globe. To keep the trail cold, politicians were never referred to by their real names in the system. They had code names like the dancer, the Dracula, the little man, or even the soccer fan. The system was so complex it had its own offshore bank in Antigua just to process the illegal transfers. They didn't just use existing banks, they literally bought their own bank to ensure no one would ever report a suspicious transaction. Now, if you watched my previous video about Switzerland, you already know Switzerland isn't just a peaceful banking hub. It's one of the most efficient financial cleaning machines ever built. And in the Odebrecht story, Switzerland keeps coming back. Not as the place where corruption starts, but where it gets refined, hidden, and redistributed. Because Odebrecht didn't just pay bribes, they engineered them. They admitted to paying around $800 million in bribes across multiple countries, one of the largest corruption operations in history. And a huge part of that money didn't move through Brazil. It moved through Switzerland. Hundreds of millions were routed into Swiss bank accounts, hidden behind offshore shell companies, fake identities, and coded transactions inside their secret systems. From there, the money was cleaned, layered, and sent back out to politicians across an entire continent. Switzerland became the financial heart of the operation, the place where dirty money stopped looking dirty. If you like what I do and would rather I not start an evil empire, consider subscribing. It's free, it helps the channel grow, and I promise not to bribe any politicians. Anyway, back to the video. While a traditional cartel risks everything to move 10 tons of powder, Odebrecht operated in broad daylight. If they wanted a $2 billion dam project, they simply authorized a $10 million payment from the structured operations budget. They inflated the cost of the projects by 20 or 30%, meaning the taxpayers were unknowingly paying for the very bribes that corrupted their leaders. It was clean, it was professional, and for 3 decades, it was completely invisible to the world. Odebrecht's influence wasn't limited to South America. They exported this corruption model to Africa. In Angola, they became the largest private employer, building everything from luxury condos to water systems. The company became so entwined with the ruling elite that it was impossible to distinguish where the firm ended and the state began. But every empire built on a lie eventually finds its Judas. And for Odebrecht, it started at a gas station. A routine money laundering investigation in Curitiba, Brazil, led investigators to a money launderer named Alberto Youssef. Youssef began to talk to save himself, pointing the finger at the highest levels of the state-run oil giant, Petrobras. This was the birth of Operation Lava Jato, or Operation Car Wash, the largest anti-corruption sting in history. The thread led investigators straight from the grease of a car wash to the marble floors of the prince's office. At first, Marcelo thought he was untouchable. He even tried to use his influence to stop the federal police. But the evidence was overwhelming. They found the Drousys servers and the MyWebDay software, unlocking a map of global corruption. In 2015, the unthinkable happened. Marcelo Odebrecht was arrested in his own home. The world watched in shock as the most powerful businessman in Latin America was handcuffed like a common criminal. He was eventually sentenced to 19 years in prison, but Marcelo was just the first domino. The list of people he had bought was much longer and more prestigious than anyone imagined. The fallout was nuclear, corrupting the entire political class of a continent simultaneously. In Brazil, President Michel Temer was charged. In Peru, former President Alejandro Toledo fled the country to avoid arrest. In Panama, President Ricardo Martinelli's world crumbled as his own sons were implicated in the bribery web. The tragedy reached its peak when Alan Garcia, the former president of Peru, chose to take his own life rather than face the shame of the Odebrecht handcuffs. And these are only the ones who got caught. Multiple heads of state, businessmen, and other powerful figures were implicated in the Odebrecht scandal, and many lost their office, their power, and in the most tragic case, even their life. This company had effectively turned the democratic process into a private auction where the highest bidder won the nation. Odebrecht had become so powerful that when it fell, it almost took the entire economy of Brazil down with it. Billions of dollars in infrastructure projects stopped overnight, leaving skeletons of concrete across the continent. Thousands of workers lost their jobs as the company's credit lines dried up and its reputation was dragged through the mud. Even Swiss authorities froze part of their accounts and started cooperating with investigators. And 365 million Swiss francs has been returned to Brazil so far. So why is this the model for a cartel? Because for 30 years, Odebrecht didn't hide in the shadows of the jungle. They sat at the table with presidents, shaped national budgets, and wrote the laws they intended to break. They were too big to fail, and in the end, they were even too big to stay in prison for long. Marcelo Odebrecht's sentence was dramatically reduced after he turned informant, revealing the secrets of his clients. He traded his silence for a luxury house arrest, a privilege a street-level cartel member would never receive. Even after the scandal, the company didn't die, it simply wiped its face and rebranded as Novonor. They changed the logo, they changed the name, but the infrastructure they built still stands as a monument to their power. The highways they built are still there, the dams are still spinning, and the politicians they bought are often still in power. The lesson for any aspiring cartel is simple. If you want to run a criminal empire, don't buy a gun. Don't waste your time building a drug lab in a basement. Go to university and buy an engineering degree. Don't build a smuggling tunnel. Build a multi-billion-dollar highway with a government-backed loan. Because in the world of dark finance, the greatest crimes aren't committed by men wearing masks. They are committed by men in expensive suits, signed with a golden pen, and hidden in plain sight. They understand that it's much safer to buy the judge and the president than it is to outrun the police. The most dangerous criminals aren't the ones the police are looking for. They're the ones the police are protecting. Real power isn't about breaking the law, it's about being the reason the law was written in the first place.